The escape. Lyra's heart raced as she darted through the dark alleyways of the alien city. The streets were filled with the sounds of soldiers shouting orders, their boots echoing off the cold metal walls. She could feel the weight of her chains, biting into her skin with every step she took. Her captors had kept her bound for years, but tonight, something was different. Tonight, she had hope. Tonight, she was going to escape. She glanced over her shoulder, seeing the distant flicker of searchlights. They were closing in on her. Lyra had to move faster. Her legs burned from the long run, but she refused to stop. She had been a slave for so long, forced to work in the mines, beaten whenever she failed to meet her master's demands. But now she was free. At least for the moment. A loud crash broke through the silence, followed by the sound of blaster fire. Lyra froze, her eyes wide with fear. Her heart skipped a beat. Who was that? Was it another patrol of guards? But no, this was different. The noise didn't sound like anything she had ever heard before. The ground beneath her shook slightly, as if something heavy had landed nearby. Without thinking, she moved toward the source of the sound, her curiosity overtaking her fear. She knew she couldn't just keep running. There had to be something she could do to escape for good. As she crept closer, she saw something she never expected, a human. He was tall, his clothes tattered from a hard journey, but there was something about him that radiated strength and confidence. He wasn't alone. Behind him, a group of people, other humans, maybe were firing their weapons at the alien soldiers, creating a small gap in their lines. The human turned quickly, his eyes locking with Lyra's. For a moment, neither of them moved. She was frozen, unsure of what to do. This was no ordinary person. His eyes, full of determination, told her he was different. His mission was clear. He was here to free someone. Then, as if reading her thoughts, the human shouted, "Over here. Come with me if you want to live." Lyra hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to run. She had been betrayed before, by her own people, by her own kind. Could she trust him? Could she trust any of them? But there was something in his voice, something that made her believe, if only for a second, that he was different. She took a step forward, then another, and soon she was sprinting towards him. The human didn't hesitate. Without a word, he grabbed her hand and pulled her into the cover of a nearby building. His grip was firm, but there was a gentleness in it that surprised her. The blaster fire continued to rain down around them, but they managed to slip into the shadows, just out of sight. For a moment, everything went quiet. Lyra's breathing was heavy, but she could feel the heat of the human's hand still gripping hers. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. She had no idea who this man was or why he was helping her. The only thing she knew was that he had saved her from the soldiers, and she was no longer running alone. "Stay here," the man whispered, his voice low but urgent. He pulled a small device from his belt and pressed a button, speaking into it. "Extraction team, this is Bravo 1. We've got one civilian in need of transport. Coordinates are 827924. I repeat, 827924. Move fast." Lyra blinked, confused. Civilian. Was she considered a civilian now? She had always been a slave, forced to work in the mines, and now this human was calling her a civilian. A surge of emotion flooded through her. Hope, fear, confusion, all tangled up in one. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. The man looked at her, his face softening. "I'm Ethan. I'm part of a team sent to rescue people like you. You've been in captivity too long." His words hit her like a slap to the face. A rescue team. Did that mean there were more of them? More humans out there, fighting to free slaves like her? Are you going to help me?" Lyra asked, unsure if she should even believe him. After all, who would risk their life for someone like her? Ethan nodded. "That's the plan. We get you out of here, then we get you somewhere safe. Just hang on a little longer." Lyra nodded, though her mind was still in a whirlwind. She had been safe before, only to be betrayed. But Ethan's words seemed different, more sincere, and his touch, though brief, made her feel like maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. Suddenly, the sound of heavy footsteps broke through the silence. Lyra tensed, but Ethan held up his hand. He didn't seem worried. In fact, he looked almost confident. "They're coming," Lyra whispered, her eyes darting around, trying to find a way out. Ethan didn't respond at first. Instead, he crouched down beside her, pressing a button on his wrist. A low hum filled the air, and the ground beneath them seemed to shake once more. Then, the sound of a vehicle, something fast and powerful, roared into the alley. A sleek, black transport ship hovered just above the ground, its engines glowing with a soft blue light. Without another word, Ethan pulled Lyra to her feet. "Time to go," he said, his voice steady. "Get in." Lyra didn't hesitate. She didn't have time to think about it anymore. She had to trust him. She had to believe that this was her chance to escape, for good. As they ran toward the ship, Lyra could feel the eyes of her captors on her. But this time, she wasn't alone. She was being rescued. And for the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe in the possibility of a future where she wasn't a slave, where she was free. The doors of the transport closed behind them, and Lyra looked out the small window as the city disappeared beneath them. For the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of hope. And with Ethan by her side, maybe, just maybe, she had found something even more powerful than freedom. Love. Trust issues. Lyra sat in the corner of the cramped ship, her eyes darting nervously between the humans around her. The interior was sleek and advanced, but none of it felt real to her. Not yet. Her entire life had been filled with the grim realities of slavery, of endless work and suffering. And now, after a single encounter with a stranger, she was free. It didn't make sense. Freedom wasn't something given. It was something fought for. She had been given no such privilege before. Could she trust this man, Ethan, who had pulled her from the clutches of the alien soldiers without a second thought? The hum of the ship's engines was the only sound, but it did nothing to calm her nerves. The faces of the other humans aboard were friendly, but distant. They didn't look at her with suspicion. They looked at her with pity, as if she were some fragile creature that needed protection. That was how slaves were often seen: broken, weak, desperate for someone to take control of their lives. She wasn't broken. She was just surviving. She had learned to survive, even if it meant bearing the weight of her own mistrust. Ethan, on the other hand, was different. He was unlike anyone she had ever met. Where others saw a slave, he had seen a person worth saving. And when he had pulled her from the streets, she had felt something in his touch, something gentle, something caring. But was that just an act? A part of some grand scheme to make her feel safe so she would follow him, just like every other time she had been manipulated? After all, trust was a luxury Lyra could no longer afford. Ethan moved to sit beside her, and for a moment, their eyes met. His expression softened, and Lyra immediately turned away, her gaze fixed on the floor. She couldn't let herself fall for his kindness. Not again. "You're safe now," Ethan said, his voice low, yet carrying an undeniable warmth. "No one's going to hurt you anymore." Lyra's heart pounded at the sincerity in his voice, but her instincts screamed for caution. "I don't need saving," she replied, her voice sharp. "I survived on my own." Ethan sighed, rubbing the back of his neck as he leaned back in his seat. He seemed to understand the weight of her words. "I'm not trying to save you, Lyra," he said quietly. "I'm just trying to help you. You've been through enough." She looked up at him, confusion clouding her features. Help? What did that mean? People didn't help others without expecting something in return. Everyone had their price, especially in a galaxy like this one. She had learned that lesson too many times to ignore it now. But Ethan seemed different. His eyes didn't hold the cold calculation of others who had used her for their own gain. His eyes, his presence, seemed to hold something human. He looked at her not as a victim, but as an equal. But still, something gnawed at her. Her past kept resurfacing, memories of false promises, broken trust, and the cold emptiness that came with betrayal. She couldn't afford to be naive. Not again. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice low and filled with suspicion. Ethan seemed taken aback by the directness of her question. He paused before answering, and Lyra could see the conflict in his eyes. Maybe he had expected her to be grateful, maybe even indebted to him. But she wasn't interested in playing that game. She had learned long ago that gratitude could be just as dangerous as anything else. "I don't want anything from you, Lyra," he finally said, his voice steady. "I'm just trying to do the right thing. I've seen too many people suffer at the hands of the Empire, and I can't turn away from that. I want to make sure you're safe. I want to make sure you have a chance to live a life of your own." Lyra's heart clenched. A life of your own. The phrase echoed in her mind, but it felt foreign, almost impossible. She had never known a life of her own. She had always been someone else's property, someone else's tool. Could such a life even exist for her? A life without chains, without fear? For a moment, she stayed silent, her mind swirling with conflicting emotions. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that there could be something more, something better. But trust didn't come easily. Trust was earned, not given. The ship's lights flickered as it made a sudden turn, and the motion pulled Lyra from her thoughts. She noticed Ethan glance at the control panel, his brow furrowed. Something was wrong. She could sense it in the air, the same way she had felt the shift in the mood back on her home planet before everything went wrong. "What is it?" Lyra asked, her voice tight with unease. Ethan didn't answer right away. He stood up, moving quickly to the cockpit. Lyra's pulse quickened as the atmosphere inside the ship grew tense. She didn't know much about starships, but she knew that look on his face. It was the same look her masters had when they knew something was about to go terribly wrong. "Stay here," Ethan said, his voice sharp. But Lyra wasn't going to sit idly by. Ignoring his command, she slipped out of her seat and followed him toward the cockpit. As she approached, she saw what had caught his attention, a small blip on the radar, an incoming signal. Ethan looked at her with a mix of frustration and concern. "I told you to stay put. I don't need you to tell me what to do." Lyra snapped back. "What's happening?" Ethan didn't reply immediately, his focus still on the radar. The blip was growing larger. "It's a ship," he said finally, "and it's coming fast." Lyra felt a jolt of panic. "Is it them? The Empire?" Ethan didn't answer. He tapped a few buttons on the control panel, adjusting their course. "We need to lose them," he muttered under his breath, his hands moving quickly over the controls. The ship lurched again, the sudden movement sending Lyra stumbling toward Ethan. He caught her arm, steadying her, but his grip was firm. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low but urgent. "You need to trust me, Lyra. Whatever happens, you need to stay close." The blip on the radar was now dangerously close. Lyra's stomach twisted in knots. She had spent too long in fear, never knowing who would betray her next. Was Ethan any different? She met his gaze, her eyes hard, but her heart aching for something she couldn't quite define. "I don't know if I can," she whispered. Ethan's expression softened, but there was no time for answers. The ship's warning system beeped loudly, signaling the enemy was within range. Ethan turned back to the controls, focusing all his attention on evading them. As the ship accelerated, Lyra gripped the nearest support beam. The ship rocked violently as it dodged incoming fire, and Lyra's pulse raced. She couldn't help it. She had to trust him. For better or worse, this was the only chance she had. The enemy revealed. The ship shuddered violently as another blast struck its hull. Lyra felt the sharp vibration reverberate through her body. The warning system blared, and lights flickered on and off, adding a sense of urgency to the already chaotic atmosphere. Ethan's hands flew across the control panel, his face set in a mask of concentration. But Lyra could see the tension in his jaw, the way his muscles tensed under the pressure. They were in trouble. "We can't keep this up forever," Ethan shouted, his voice strained as he slammed a button on the console. "We need to get out of here now." Lyra's heart hammered in her chest as she looked out the small viewport. The pursuing ship, a sleek, black vessel, was gaining on them with terrifying speed. Its weapons were powerful, the green laser blasts lighting up the dark expanse of space like a deadly firestorm. She could feel the heat from the shots, even inside the ship, the fear in her chest choking her thoughts. Ethan cursed under his breath, his fingers dancing across the controls, trying to shake their pursuers. The ship lurched again as another blast struck their shields, sending a wave of force that pushed Lyra back into her seat. "Who are they?" Lyra asked, struggling to keep her voice steady. "What do they want with us?" Ethan didn't answer right away. His jaw clenched as he looked at the radar screen, watching as the enemy ship stayed locked on them. He muttered something under his breath, before his gaze met hers with a seriousness that sent a cold chill down her spine. "They're not part of the Empire. At least not directly," he said, his tone grim. "They're a mercenary group, a ruthless one, led by someone who has a personal interest in finding you." Lyra's mind raced. "Someone has a personal interest in finding me." The words didn't make sense. She had never been more than a tool, a slave. Who would want to look for her, let alone chase her down in space? Who would want me?" she asked, her voice a whisper. The question felt absurd, but it hung heavy in the air between them. Ethan didn't look at her immediately. His eyes were locked on the control panel, his brow furrowed in frustration. "A woman like you has value," he said finally. "More than you realize." Lyra frowned. "Value? I'm just a slave." Ethan interrupted, his voice cutting through the air with a sharpness that surprised her. "I know what you've been through, Lyra. I've seen the scars. But you're more than that. You've got something that these mercenaries want, something they'll stop at nothing to get." For a moment, all Lyra could do was stare at him, trying to process his words. She had been a slave her whole life. She had been trained to obey, to serve. The idea that she could have something of value, something more than her labor, her body, felt alien, incomprehensible. Her chest tightened, and for the first time, she felt a flicker of doubt. Could it be true? Could she really be worth more than the chains that had bound her for so long? The ship jolted again, tearing her from her thoughts. She gripped the side of her seat to steady herself. Through the viewport, she saw the enemy vessel drawing closer, its weapons charging for another round of fire. "We're not going to outrun them," Ethan said through gritted teeth, "but I can give us a chance." Lyra's pulse quickened. "What do you mean? How can we fight them off?" Ethan glanced at her with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. "We don't. Not yet. I've got a plan. But I need you to trust me." Lyra swallowed hard. Trust. The word had always been a bitter one for her, something that had only brought pain and loss. But looking at Ethan, looking at the resolve in his eyes, she felt something stir inside her. Maybe, just maybe, she could trust him, just for this moment, if only to survive. The ship suddenly veered sharply to the left, throwing Lyra off balance. She struggled to hold onto the seat, her breath coming fast as she saw the space around them shift. The enemy ship was closing in fast, too fast. She could feel the pressure building in her chest as the tension of the moment tightened around them both. "Hold on," Ethan said, his voice steadied despite the chaos. She did as he asked, bracing herself as the ship began to maneuver wildly, zigzagging through the empty space. The mercenary vessel followed, relentless and precise. Ethan's fingers worked furiously over the control panel, his brow beaded with sweat. "Hang tight," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is going to get bumpy." Without warning, the ship dropped sharply, descending toward a nearby asteroid belt. Lyra's stomach lurched as the ship angled downward, its hull groaning under the sudden strain. She heard the enemy ship roar above them, unable to follow their descent due to the dense field of asteroids blocking their path. The maneuver bought them a brief moment of respite, but Ethan wasn't done. He punched in a new set of coordinates, and the ship shot forward, threading through the maze of asteroids with frightening speed. The rock formations were close, too close. Lyra could hear them scraping against the hull, the loud crashes filling her ears as the ship narrowly avoided collision. The enemy ship followed, but its movements were more cautious now. The mercenaries couldn't risk crashing into the rocks themselves. They slowed their pace, giving Ethan and Lyra a brief window of safety. "I've got an idea," Ethan muttered, his eyes flicking between the radar and the asteroid belt. "We need to hit the gas and make it to the other side of the belt before they can line up another shot." Lyra nodded, her mouth dry. "What happens if they get us?" Ethan didn't answer, but the grim look in his eyes said everything. It wasn't a question of if. It was a question of when. With a deep breath, Ethan slammed his hand onto the accelerator, and the ship lurched forward, breaking free from the asteroid field. But their pursuers were right behind them. The mercenary ship had found its opening, and another volley of blasts sent shockwaves through Lyra's body. The ship's shields were holding for now, but for how long? "Hold on," Ethan shouted again, his voice tight with urgency. Lyra closed her eyes, her heart pounding. The noise, the tension, the constant pressure, it was too much. But this was it. This was her chance to survive. And, for reasons she couldn't fully understand, it was now tied to this man, Ethan. The future felt uncertain. But in that moment, she had no choice but to place her faith in him. The fight for her freedom had just begun, and it was only going to get more dangerous from here. The hidden truth. Lyra's hands trembled as she braced herself against the console. The ship rocked violently again, and she gritted her teeth, determined not to show her fear. They had escaped the asteroid belt, but the enemy ship wasn't far behind. Lyra's mind raced, her thoughts tangled with fear, confusion, and a deep, gnawing sense of uncertainty. What did Ethan mean when he said she had something of value? How could a woman like her, someone who had been nothing more than a slave, be worth anything more than a tool for someone's use? Ethan's voice pulled her from her spiraling thoughts. "We're not out of the woods yet," he said, his face tight with concentration. "They're still following, and if we don't shake them soon, we won't make it." Lyra's eyes flicked to the controls as Ethan made another set of quick adjustments, pushing the ship into a series of sharp turns, trying to lose the mercenaries in the vast emptiness of space. The blackness outside seemed endless, but the red dots on the radar screen told a different story. Their pursuers were closing in. Fast. "Can you explain who they are? Who's chasing us?" Lyra asked, her voice shaking slightly. Her mind was still reeling from the conversation earlier. Someone had a personal interest in her. What did that mean? Who could possibly want her? Ethan didn't answer immediately. His eyes remained glued to the radar, as his fingers danced across the control panel. He was calculating their next move, but there was something different in his silence. Lyra could feel the tension radiating off him, like a weight pressing down on him. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke, his voice low and heavy with regret. "It's not just the mercenaries. They're working for someone far worse." Lyra swallowed hard. Worse? Who could be worse than them? Ethan hesitated for a moment, then glanced at her, his eyes flicking to the blinking lights of the radar. "They work for the Orden." His voice was barely a whisper, as if saying the name aloud somehow made it more real. "The Orden?" Lyra echoed, the name unfamiliar but heavy with an ominous weight. "Who are they?" "They're a powerful, shadowy organization that controls a vast network of mercenaries, criminals, and political forces across the galaxy," Ethan explained, his voice rough. "They're ruthless, unrelenting, and they're the ones who wanted to buy you." Lyra's chest tightened. "Buy me," she repeated, her breath catching in her throat. But I'm not. I'm not some object to be sold. What do they want with me? Ethan's face darkened as he clenched his fists. The Orden doesn't just buy people for their labor, Lyra. They buy them for their power. His eyes met hers, his expression serious. You have something inside of you, something they want, and they'll stop at nothing to get it. Her heart skipped a beat. Power? What kind of power? Ethan's gaze softened for a moment, but then he shook his head. I don't know exactly what it is, but I've seen it before. The way the Orden operates, they never chase something unless it's worth more than anything else. And they believe you hold the key to it. Lyra's thoughts raced, but everything felt too much, too fast. She had spent her life trapped in a cell, treated like an object. She had never been told she was anything more than that. To hear that she held power, that she could be something more, felt like a cruel joke. Could she really be the key to something bigger than herself? How could she be when she didn't even know who she was? The ship jolted again, throwing her out of her thoughts. She gripped the seat harder, her heart hammering in her chest. The enemy ship had caught up, and now they were on a direct collision course. Lyra could see the lasers charging once more, ready to fire. Ethan, they're going to shoot us down, she shouted, her panic rising. I know, he yelled back, his voice frantic but focused. I need you to trust me. We have one shot at this. Lyra's stomach turned as she saw the dark silhouette of the enemy ship looming larger in the viewport. She was terrified, but she could also see the determination in Ethan's eyes. He wasn't just fighting to survive. He was fighting for something more. And she, despite her fear, had to fight too. She had to find out what they were after. What are you going to do? Lyra asked, her voice trembling. I'm going to take us into a blind jump. The ship's old, and it might be risky, but it's our only chance, Ethan said, his jaw set in determination. We won't be able to predict where we're going, but it'll throw them off long enough for us to escape. Lyra looked at him, her mind racing. She had no idea what he was talking about, but she understood one thing. He wasn't about to let them die here. And maybe, just maybe, she could start trusting him. Do it, she whispered, her voice steady despite the fear that clutched at her chest. She wasn't sure what she was trusting him with, but there was no turning back now. Ethan nodded once, his fingers moving over the control panel with purpose. Lyra's heart skipped a beat as the ship jolted forward, and they plummeted into the void of space, past the enemy ship as it unleashed its plasma blast into nothingness. The ship shot forward, twisting and turning in ways Lyra didn't think possible. The stars outside blurred as they sped into the unknown, their pursuit slowly fading behind them. The moment of suspense stretched on, and then the ship jolted to a complete stop. Silence. The stars outside seemed different, less familiar. There was no sign of the mercenary ship, no sign of the Orden's deadly grip. They had made it. For now. Lyra took a deep breath, her chest rising and falling with the weight of the moment. She turned to Ethan, her mind still whirling with questions. Where are we? Ethan's face was pale, his knuckles white from gripping the control panel. We're not where we should be, he said softly, his voice haunted. We're somewhere else. And I think that's exactly where the Orden wants us to be. Lyra stared at him, her heart pounding in her chest. What do you mean? Ethan looked at her, his eyes filled with uncertainty. I think we just walked into the heart of their trap. The heart of the trap. The silence in the ship was deafening. Lyra sat frozen, her breath shallow as she stared at the control panel, trying to make sense of their new reality. The stars outside the viewport no longer seemed like distant, unreachable points of light. Instead, they felt closer, almost suffocating, as if something was watching them from beyond the fabric of space. It was a feeling Lyra couldn't shake, a gnawing sense that they weren't just running from their pursuers anymore. They were heading straight into something far more dangerous. Ethan was tense beside her, his eyes flicking from one screen to another, his hands moving in quick, practiced motions. He looked like a man on the edge of control, his brow furrowed, and his lips set in a tight line. Despite his calm outward appearance, Lyra could sense his unease. He was hiding something. She just wasn't sure what. "What are we doing here, Ethan?" Lyra asked, her voice breaking the oppressive silence. "Where are we?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. His fingers hovered over the controls for a moment. Then he let out a long, slow breath and turned to her. His eyes were filled with something she couldn't quite place. Fear, regret. She couldn't tell. "We're in the Oort Nebula," he said, his voice soft but heavy. "It's a dead zone, a place where ships rarely pass through. Most of the galaxy has abandoned it, and for good reason. It's been forgotten." But his eyes narrowed, and he looked away, focusing on the blinking lights in front of him. "I think we're exactly where they want us to be." Lyra's stomach turned. "The Orden?" Ethan nodded grimly. "Yeah, they know we're here. This is no accident." Lyra's chest tightened. "How can they know? We jumped blind." He let out a low, bitter laugh. "Because they've been watching me. And now they're watching you." Lyra's heart skipped. "Watching me?" Ethan nodded again, a haunted look in his eyes. "You're not just some random slave, Lyra. You never were. You were part of a plan, a long time ago. A plan to capture you, and others like you." Lyra's mind raced. "Others like me? What are you talking about?" Ethan turned to face her fully now, his gaze intense. "The Orden aren't just interested in the slaves, Lyra. They'd want the bloodlines." He looked at her as if waiting for her to understand something he couldn't put into words. But Lyra was lost, confused. "Bloodlines," she repeated. "What do you mean?" "There are more of you," he said, his voice low, barely above a whisper. "More like you, alien women, humans, and others. They've been mixing bloodlines, experimenting. Some of those bloodlines have powers, abilities that the Orden wants, abilities that you have." Lyra felt a chill run down her spine. The room seemed to close in on her, the reality of his words settling in like a heavy weight. Powers. Her. She was just a slave, a mere tool used for labor. She had no special abilities. No powers. But then she remembered the strange feeling she had sometimes, the odd sensation that ran through her when she was afraid, the strange energy that seemed to surge in her when she was in danger. She had always written it off as fear, as her body's natural response to the horrors she had lived through. But now it felt different. Could it be true? Could she really have something inside her that the Orden wanted so badly? "What do you mean, abilities?" Lyra asked, her voice trembling despite her efforts to remain calm. Ethan's face was tight, his gaze flicking from her to the stars outside the window. "I'm not sure, Lyra, but I've seen people with powers before. The Orden has a way of tracking them, harvesting them. And when they found you, they'd made sure to keep you close. They'd been keeping an eye on you your whole life. And when they thought they could control you, they'd made you one of their own." Lyra's mind reeled. "But I was just a slave. How could they use me?" "They didn't want you for your body, Lyra. They wanted you because they knew something you didn't," Ethan said, his voice tightening. "They knew you had something inside you, something that could make them invincible. And the only way they could get it was by keeping you under control. That's why they took you." She shook her head, disbelieving. No, this doesn't make sense." "Then why do you think they're chasing us so hard?" Ethan's voice was harsh now, frustration creeping into his tone. "It's not just about money. It's about power. And they'll do whatever it takes to get it." Lyra was silent, trying to make sense of it all. The words swirled in her mind, but nothing seemed to fit. Her past, her life, everything she had known, was being turned upside down. What had she been? A slave, yes. But now she was a target, a weapon in someone else's war, and she didn't even know how to control whatever it was that made her so valuable. I don't even know what this power is," she whispered, her voice cracking with fear. "How could I? I've never been anything but a slave." Ethan's expression softened, a flicker of empathy in his eyes. He reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I know. But you're more than that. You are more than that. You've always had the strength inside you, Lyra. You've just never had the chance to realize it." Her breath caught. "How do you know that?" Ethan paused, his eyes looking distant. "Because I've seen it before. The way you move, the way you react under pressure. It's more than just instinct. You're different, Lyra. And the Orden knows it." Before Lyra could respond, the ship lurched suddenly, sending her crashing back into her seat. She gasped as the room was filled with flashing red lights and alarms blaring through the cabin. "They found us," Ethan said, his voice grim as he slammed his hand onto the control panel. "And we're about to find out if we're ready to fight back." The ship shook again as another blast struck their shields. The enemy ship was closing in fast. Lyra gripped the seat in front of her heart pounding, but she felt something inside her, something that she couldn't quite explain, begin to stir. She wasn't just a slave anymore. She wasn't helpless. She was about to find out what the Orden wanted from her, and if she had the strength to stop them. "Ethan," she said, her voice steady, "how do we fight them?" Ethan didn't hesitate. "We fight with everything we have." And for the first time in her life, Lyra felt like she might actually stand a chance. The power within. The ship rocked again as Lyra gripped the armrest, her body tensing with each shudder. The bright red warning lights on the control panel flashed frantically as Ethan fought to keep them steady. The mercenary ship was relentless in its pursuit, closing in for another strike. The blasts from their weapons vibrated through the hull, each hit making Lyra's heart race, her mind spinning with the weight of everything she had learned. They were running out of time. Ethan's voice cut through the chaos. "Lyra, we can't outrun them forever. The jump drive is nearly drained. If we don't shake them off soon, we're not going anywhere." Lyra's gaze darted to the stars outside the viewport. The darkness of space was dotted with flashes of light, but they were getting closer. The enemy was right behind them, relentless. Her chest tightened as she realized the danger they were in. It wasn't just their lives at risk. It was something far more important. What did the Orden want with her? What did they know about her? A surge of emotion, fear, anger, confusion, flooded through her. But then, something else stirred. Deep within, beneath all the fear and uncertainty, she felt it. A pressure, almost like a thrum, building in her chest. Her pulse quickened, and suddenly, she could hear her heartbeat, as if it were the only sound in the universe. Ethan was still working furiously at the controls, his face grim as the ship swayed again. But Lyra wasn't looking at him. Her eyes were locked on the empty expanse of space, her mind filling with strange, inexplicable energy. The more she focused, the more she felt it, like something deep inside her was awakening. The power Ethan had spoken of, it was real. "I've always had it. I just didn't know it." The thought struck her like a thunderclap. "Ethan," she said, her voice quieter than usual, but her tone carried something new, a strange, quiet confidence she didn't quite understand. Ethan didn't look up, too focused on his efforts to evade their pursuers. "Not now, Lyra. We need tow." "No," she interrupted, a sharpness in her voice that surprised even her. "I can feel it. The power. It's inside me." Ethan paused for a brief second, his hands frozen on the control panel. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice low, almost suspicious. "I don't know what it is, but it's there. And I think I can use it," she said, her words gaining strength with every passing moment. The sensation within her grew more intense, almost alive, a thrumming power that resonated within her very bones. Ethan turned to her now, his brow furrowed in disbelief. "Lyra, you don't understand. You can't just." "I can," she cut in, her voice firm and unshakable. Her hands were trembling slightly, but the strange energy inside her only seemed to grow stronger. I have to try. Her eyes burned with a strange fire as she stood up from her seat, her legs shaky but resolute. The pressure in her chest, in her very soul, was now undeniable. It wasn't fear that surged within her anymore. It was something else, something ancient, something powerful. She stretched out her hand toward the control panel, her fingers brushing against the cool surface of the console. At that moment, the room seemed to shift around her. The flashing lights, the shrieking alarms, all faded into the background. There was only the energy inside her, and the hum of the ship around her. A pulse of light flickered through her fingertips, and the ship shuddered again. Ethan's eyes widened in shock as the console in front of her began to flicker and hum in response to the surge of energy Lyra had just released. "What did you do?" he asked, his voice tight with disbelief. "I don't know," Lyra whispered. She could feel the ship shifting, the controls responding to her thoughts, to the strange power flowing through her. "But I think I can control it." Before Ethan could respond, the enemy ship fired again. This time, the blast struck closer, and the hull groaned under the strain. The ship lurched violently, throwing Lyra back into her seat. The pain shot through her body, but the moment it did, something in her clicked. Without thinking, she reached out again, her hand almost instinctively reaching for the energy that swirled inside her. The power surged forward, and she felt it push outward, surrounding her. The ship groaned again, but this time it was different. The energy Lyra had summoned seemed to feed into the ship's core, stabilizing it, reinforcing its shields with an invisible force. "What the hell?" Ethan muttered, staring at the controls as the ship's systems suddenly surged back to life, the hull strengthening, the vibrations easing. Lyra didn't have time to explain. She focused on the enemy ship. Her breath steadied, and without thinking, she extended her palm out toward the oncoming vessel. She could feel it, the surge of power that rippled from her hand, coursing through the air like an invisible wave. The ship's weapon systems charged for another blast, but as the power inside her reached its peak, she willed it. The pulse she released was as raw and untrained as her emotions, but it worked. A blast of energy shot from her hand, a brilliant beam that hit the mercenary ship with an explosive force. The impact sent shockwaves through the void, rocking their enemy's ship off course. Sparks flew from its engines, and the ship's weapon systems short-circuited. The enemy ship veered to the side, struggling to maintain control, its trajectory thrown off balance. Ethan stared, wide-eyed, at the scene unfolding before him. Did you just do that?" Lyra could barely believe what she had just done. The power, that thrum of energy, it had responded to her. It had bent to her will. She had never felt anything like it. She had never believed in such things. Powers, abilities. She had always been told she was weak. But now, "I didn't do it on purpose," Lyra said, still trying to process what had just happened. She could still feel the aftershocks of the energy coursing through her, and the idea of it terrified her. It felt wrong, but also like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Does it matter?" Ethan asked, his voice a mix of awe and urgency. He grabbed her by the shoulders, shaking her lightly. "Lyra, that was incredible. If you can do that, we have a chance. No, we have a real chance to stop them." She blinked, her mind clouded with the weight of everything that had just happened. "Stop them," she whispered. "How?" Ethan's expression hardened, his voice firm. "We use what you have inside you. We make them afraid. We show them that they've underestimated us. You don't need to be a slave anymore, Lyra. You can fight back, and I'm going to help you." Lyra looked into his eyes, her heart racing with new purpose. They were no longer running. They were no longer victims. For the first time in her life, she was going to take control of her own fate. And she was going to make the Orden regret ever underestimating her. The reckoning. The stars outside the viewport were a blur, stretching into long white streaks as Ethan pushed the ship to its limits. The power surge from Lyra's unexpected display had bought them precious moments, but the enemy wasn't finished yet. The mercenary ship, battered but far from destroyed, was regrouping. It had taken them by surprise once, but it wouldn't happen again. Lyra sat in the co-pilot's seat, her hands clenched tight around the armrests, her heart still pounding from the sudden rush of power she had unleashed. It was a strange feeling, being both exhilarated and terrified at once. She could feel the energy deep within her, thrumming like a second heartbeat. It was raw, untamed, and powerful, but there was also a deep sense of wrongness about it. The more she used it, the more the power seemed to grow, like an endless well that could swallow her whole. Was it dangerous? Was it something she could control? The thought gnawed at her. "What are we going to do now?" she asked, her voice tight with the weight of their situation. Ethan's expression was unreadable as he continued to navigate the ship through the dark abyss. His fingers flew across the control panel, activating systems, making adjustments to the shields, the weapons, everything. "We're going to take the fight to them," he said firmly. His eyes met hers for a moment, and Lyra saw something there, something like a promise. "They won't get away with this." Lyra's lips parted as she processed his words. Ethan was determined, more than she had ever seen him. It wasn't just about survival anymore. He was fighting for something greater. For her. For them both. She had been a slave for so long, a prisoner of fate, of others' choices. But now, with the power coursing through her, she realized just how much control she had over her own destiny. It wasn't just about freedom anymore. It was about vengeance. It was about justice. But she needed to understand this power. She needed to master it, or it would destroy her, and everyone she cared about. Ethan turned to her, his brow furrowing. "Lyra, are you with me? We have one shot at this. If we don't take them out now, we won't get another chance." The weight of his words settled heavily in her chest. She nodded, feeling the surge of resolve rising within her. There was no going back. The Orden had made their move. They thought they could control her, but she wasn't some mindless slave anymore. She wasn't going to run or hide. Lyra's eyes narrowed as she stood, her heart steady now, her hands shaking, but not from fear, from power. "I'm with you," she said softly. The words seemed to settle into her, like a new truth she had just discovered. She was with Ethan, and together, they would face whatever came next. The comms system buzzed, and a distorted voice crackled through the speakers. Lyra's blood ran cold as she recognized the deep, gruff tone. "This is Commander Graven of the Orden Mercenary Fleet. You have made a grave mistake, human and alien. Surrender now, and we will spare your lives. Resist, and you will die in the cold, empty void." The ship's speakers hissed with static, and then the voice cut off. But the message was clear. There was no mercy. Ethan's hands tightened around the controls, his jaw set in a hard line. "They won't stop. Not unless we give them a reason to. We need to make them feel what we've been through." Lyra's fingers brushed the console in front of her. The energy inside her stirred again, responding to her will. It was so much stronger now. The ship seemed to hum with it, like it was alive, a part of her. She could feel its every movement, its every pulse, as if the ship were an extension of herself. She turned to Ethan, her eyes alight with newfound determination. "I can do this," she said. "I'll stop them." Ethan's eyes met hers, a flicker of worry crossing his features. "I know you can, Lyra. But I need you to be careful. If we push too hard—" "I know," she interrupted. "But this is the only way. We can't keep running. We have to end it now." She reached out with both hands, palms open, fingers trembling but steady as she connected with the ship's core. The power inside her surged, a lightning bolt of force that connected with the ship's systems. The whole vessel hummed, shuddered, and then Lyra pushed. She didn't just control the ship's systems anymore. She controlled the very energy that coursed through it. The power surged from her, a brilliant pulse of light that rippled through the hull, pouring out into space like a shockwave. The ship's shields flared, growing stronger with each second, absorbing the energy like a sponge. Ethan's eyes widened as the ship seemed to grow in size, in presence, in sheer force. "What the hell are you doing?" he asked, but his voice was no longer filled with fear. It was awe. "I'm giving them a taste of their own medicine," Lyra said, her voice quiet but powerful. Her eyes glowed with an otherworldly light as the ship surged forward, straight into the heart of the enemy fleet. Commander Graven's voice crackled again through the comms, this time tinged with desperation. "No. Stop. You cannot win." But it was too late. Lyra's power had reached its peak. She felt the entire Orden fleet within her grasp, felt every vessel, every movement, every intent. Her mind was racing, her senses sharp, her thoughts flowing as easily as her energy. The Orden fleet had underestimated her, and now they would learn the cost of their mistake. With a single, final push, she released it. A wave of energy shot forward, a storm of raw, unbridled power that slammed into the enemy ships with catastrophic force. It was not a single blast, but a shockwave, an immense wave that ripped through their shields, cracking them open like fragile glass. The enemy ships buckled and crumpled as the wave tore through them, their systems overloaded, their engines sparking and short-circuiting. The ship that had once threatened them now crumpled before Lyra's power, unable to withstand the onslaught. But it didn't stop there. Lyra could feel the power reaching out, pushing past the damaged fleet, heading straight for the heart of the Orden's command ship. Her eyes widened. They were going to destroy it. But she couldn't stop. Not now. The energy inside her built to an unimaginable intensity as she aimed for the command ship. She thought of all the years of pain, of suffering, of being someone else's puppet. She thought of the people who had held her in chains, and of Ethan, the man who had shown her that freedom could be hers. With one last, devastating pulse, Lyra unleashed everything she had. The Orden command ship exploded in a burst of light, disintegrating into millions of pieces in an instant. The shockwave from the explosion reverberated through space, scattering debris across the void. Silence followed. Lyra collapsed into the seat, gasping for breath. The energy that had been her strength now felt like an immense weight, pressing down on her. Ethan rushed to her side. "Lyra?" he asked, his voice full of concern. She blinked, her vision blurry, her head spinning. I did it." Ethan smiled, his face filled with pride. "You did. You stopped them. You're free, Lyra." But Lyra's gaze turned toward the stars outside the viewport. She had won. They had won. And yet, she knew this wasn't the end. There were still many battles ahead, many more challenges to face. But for the first time in her life, she felt ready. Because now, she wasn't just surviving. She was a force to be reckoned with. And the universe would remember her name.